Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to have been asked to occupy this office, and I don't think anyone so honoured can feel anything but a sense of unworthiness when he considers first the man whose memory we are here to honour tonight, and second, the list of presidents of the club who have performed this duty before him. That list is by itself remarkable testimony to the regard in which Scott has been held and is still held by those of us gathered here tonight. It includes 3 prime ministers and at least one other man, R.A. Butler, who ought to have been prime minister, but who, at least to the compensations of being President of the Royal Society of Literature and Master of Trinity, Cambridge. And as a humble member of that college myself, I might say that to my mind, the Master's Lodge is a more distinguished residence and more difficult of entry than number 10 Downing Street. There are other politicians on the list, such as recently Lord Grimond, and a bit further back, the most interesting Scottish Tory of this century, Walter Elliot, whose widow, Lady Elliot of Harwood, has also been president, and she is also, I'm sure, unique among the members of the club as being the only living person whose father was born in Scott's lifetime. It's true, 1823, Sir Charles Tennant was born. There have been senators of the College of Justice and Lord Chancellors of England, Archbishops of Canterbury, moderators of the Kirk of Scotland, at least one great commander, Lord Wavell, and great scholars like Professor Grierson and Professor David Dykes, who is here tonight. The head of the Scott family, His Grace the Duke of Buccleuch and Queensberry, has been president, and so is the present headmaster of Eton. It's an astonishing role of honour and quite something to live up to. And what am I doing in such company, I might ask, if it were not for 3 names which minister to my confidence? They're John Buchan, Hugh Walpole, and Eric Linklater. Now, Buchan, of course, who died 50 years ago this winter, was a man possessed of a daunting variety of talents, but he, Walpole, Linklater, and myself all have this at least in common, that like Sir Walter, we've all practiced the demanding, sometimes rewarding, sometimes dispiriting, but ultimately addictive craft of writing novels. And it is to Scott's meaning for a writer of fiction today that I particularly want to address myself. First, however, I would like to dwell a little longer on the significance of this list of presidents. It illustrates 2 things, I think. The first is obvious. Scott touched life at so many different points that it is not surprising that men of the highest merit in so many different walks of life should have been delighted to honour him. And they were so delighted, of course, because they found delight in his works. As a writer, and this is my second point, Scott was also a man of affairs and a man of the world. There was nothing narrowly literary about him. He wrote from an experience of men and women which was both wide and deep, and he wrote also out of an abundantly stocked mind. No novelist ever had less of the ivory tower about him. His peculiar authority, the fact that we trust his judgment of his characters, derives from his experience of affairs. It's no wonder, then, that men whose life has been passed in dealing with practical matters of the first importance should find satisfaction in the Waverley novels. They are, first of all, and this is no mean thing, something my experience as a reviewer of fiction confirms, they are, first of all, books written by an author who knows what he is talking about. There's another side of this, however, and it has been used to reproach him. He has been accused of not taking his art sufficiently seriously. Even some of his admirers have taken this tone. Hesketh Pearson, another president of the club, reproved him for this attitude in his biography. Scott had remarked that he never felt awed or abashed except in the presence of the Duke of Wellington. And Pearson says, it was suggested that perhaps the latter may have been equally affected by meeting a great poet and novelist. What would the Duke of Wellington think of a few bits of novels, Scott said, which perhaps he has never read, and for which the strong probability is that he would not care a sixpence if he had? Now, in this instance, Pearson thought that Scott's humility was a vice. To imply that literary creation was inferior to martial action displayed a lamentable lack of values. Well, perhaps. Any writer must feel flattered by this observation, just as he may experience a warm glow, for instance, when Ford Madox Ford says that Henry James was the greatest writer of my time and therefore the greatest man. But there is another side to it, and it's an important one. Art and literature can display their own arrogance, which is fine and lovely up to a point, but can be self-limiting, self-defeating, if it leads the artist to deny value to other activities. Scott never succumbed to that temptation. He agreed, I think, with Dr. Johnson that every man thinks the worse of himself for not having been a soldier. Not because he wanted to kill, but because he recognized what he had missed by not having been tested in battle. It is Scott's ability to ascribe value to all sorts of human activity, which is the mark of his seriousness as a writer, as it is also the reason for his scope. Indeed, I would go further and suggest that it is a characteristic of the greatest writers to escape the prison of art. The true seriousness in art may be demonstrated by a refusal to regard art as being the all-in-all of life. To recognize also that its subject may be a world where art has very little meaning. We all know that Scott said that literature was a good staff, but an ill crutch. And normally, these words are given a narrow application. But they can, I think, bear a wider one. That literature or art should be seen as a desirable part of life, but not the most important. We all know the moral problem. Would you save a Leonardo or a child from a burning house? I have no doubt Scott would have saved the child. Indeed, I have no doubt he would have saved a dog. And I think he was not only a better man for this, but arguably a better writer, because these were his standards. I doubt if he could have created the character of Jeannie Deans if he had thought otherwise. And when I consider the two Scotts, who are my predecessors here as novelist presidents, John Buchan and Eric Linklater, I observe in them the same feeling or temper. It is wrong to call this a dissatisfaction with art, but it is undoubtedly a feeling that art is essentially part of life, not a substitute for it. I would go further and say this is a characteristic of Scottish literature. You can see the same concerns for life beyond literature in writers as various as Byron, Stevenson, and Hugh MacDiarmid. Now, this temper is reflected in the kind of novels Scott wrote. I would suggest to you that there are two types of novel: the self-enclosed and the open. I would not claim superiority for either. Great novels of both kinds have been written, and I would not pretend that the two categories are absolute. Categories in fiction never are. What is called genre fiction, for example, escapes the limit of the genre when it is well done. I might take P.D. James, Raymond Chandler, and indeed John Buchan as examples of writers working within the normally restrictive limits of a type of fiction who escape its boundaries. So there is always, as it were, a middle kingdom between the types of novel, and Scott himself, as in St. Ronan's Wells and The Antiquary, inhabits that middle kingdom. But I've done no more than name these categories, and my understanding of them may not be clear. By the self-enclosed novel, I mean one which makes no reference, or almost no reference, to anything beyond itself. Such novels belong to their age, of course, but they do not appear to be set in time. Time, of course, passes within them, but there is no consciousness that any events in the world of fact beyond the novel might influence the behavior or lives of its characters. Typically, such novels pose moral problems which are resolved dramatically. They can achieve miracles of refinement because everything relevant is contained within their compass. What their characters escape is the influence, impeding, impelling, distorting, or enriching of hard historical fact. All characters live in and take their life in a novel from the author's imagination. The author chooses what to put in or what to leave out, and this is true of all novels. But in some, historical events are themselves characters, and in others, they are not. If I ask you to consider the influence of history or of political events on Jane Austen's Emma, or Henry James's Isabel Archer, or on Heathcliff and Catherine Earnshaw, the question is all but meaningless, because the relation of these characters to that world is so tenuous. The novel has, as it were, been abstracted from it. Now, the Waverley novels are quite different. They are all open to the winds of history. Events happen in time and space, in a particular year, and often in an identified place. Henry Morton's dilemma in Old Mortality is, of course, occasioned by his character, but it is specifically provoked by the times in which he lives. Also, one might add, by geography. The bitter animosities of the characters with whom he comes into contact are historical facts. There is, Scott shows us, for a man of a certain stamp at a certain time, no escaping history. It is history, working in conjunction with personal qualities, which forms or deforms men's lives. We are never allowed to forget its influence. Waverley itself could not exist as a novel but for history. The Heart of Midlothian begins with the Porteous riots. All mortality rings with the savage dialectic of Covenanter and Cavalier. The Bride of Lammermoor, though intensely dramatic in a manner which might seem to approach the self-enclosed novel, is nevertheless fixed in history. We recognize the political winds according to which the Lord Keeper tries to trim, and the comedy of Caleb Balderston would be almost meaningless if we did not bring to it some understanding of feudal rights and loyalties. The wonderful melancholy of Red Gauntlet, a melancholy that suffuses the novel, despite its wealth of attractive characters, stirring incident, rich comedy. This melancholy, which is its distinguishing mark, its distinguishing mood, is occasioned not only by the awareness of necessity that echoes through the novel, but by our knowledge of the historical circumstances which constrain the characters. And Red Gauntlet's great cry, "Then is the cause lost indeed," draws at least some of its pathos from fact. I doubt if we would feel the same pathos if the cause he lamented was a purely imaginary one. It is the knowledge that we bring from beyond the world, beyond the novel, which makes it so peculiarly poignant. Now, some critics may disparage this. They may argue that a work of art should be self-sufficient, that it should not be necessary for it to make any reference to anything beyond itself, that such reference dilutes the imagination. This appears to me the extremity of purism. Moreover, it is an unattainable ambition. We all, whether as writers or readers, bring our own experience to a novel and read it in the light of that experience. At the very least, we judge every novel in terms of our own knowledge or experience of human nature. A novel has to touch at some point our understanding of existence if it is not to seem misguided, inadequate, and ultimately worthless. This is as true of the self-enclosed novel as of the open one. Let me digress a moment, or put the matter in another way. I've long thought that in writing a novel, the central, inescapable problem is to effect a marriage between what goes on in your head and what you see out of the window. This seems to me a very obvious truism. It is perhaps such a commonplace that it is easily ignored. But that is the problem, and it may be understood best if you consider what happens when one of these matrimonial partners achieves a complete dominance over the other. If the first gets the upper hand and the view from the window is blocked up, then the living and invigorating imagination, which is its proper characteristic, degenerates into mere fancy and fantasy. The novelist who can make anything happen because he or she has no respect for contingency or fact makes nothing significant happen, for the work is all air and bubbles. But if the other spouse prevails, and the view from the window is everything, if observation and fact are taken as all sufficient, then the author may achieve realism of a sort, but it is an inadequate realism, because the vital element of imagination, the sense of possibility, has been stifled. Now, the view from Scott's window was extensive. He cast his observing eye across the country and back in time. The pressure of historical fact of ineluctable circumstance molds the fate and fortunes of his characters. He scarcely ever allows you to forget this. The appearance in his cast of characters, the appearance in his cast of characters whom we know to have had a date of birth and death, and to have performed actions of historical significance, keeps his narrative floating on the river of historical time. His characters can never escape contingency. In another age or setting, in Scott's own time, for instance, a Balfour of Burleigh might be confined to the role of a sour domestic tyrant, his fanaticism expressing itself in sermons that gratified the self-righteous vanity of his audience, but inspired them to no violent action. The Scotland of the 1670s offered such a man wider opportunities, just as, translated into modern terms, he might find himself as a political terrorist. The influence shed by Scott's awareness of history and his use of history was very great. You have to consider what had gone immediately before him to measure it. Without exactly despising their methods or achievements, indeed still making some use of their work, he scattered the moonbeams and cobwebs of Gothic romance and brought the real world of fact into fiction. Stendhal, though he professed not to admire the Waverley novels, learned from him. So, more obviously, did Balzac and Victor Hugo. So in Russia did Lermontov and Turgenev and Dostoevsky. So, most of all, did Tolstoy. War and Peace, conventionally, and with reason, regarded as the greatest of novels, is inconceivable without the example of Scott. The way in which Tolstoy mixes imaginary and historical characters, the way he lets us see the historical characters through the eyes of the imaginary ones, the way in which his characters' lives are twisted, deformed, and broken by their experience of history. All this derives from Scott. And the influence persists. Conrad is not, I think, a novelist whom many would associate with Scott. Conrad, that agonized, self-conscious artist with a search for the mot juste, the significant, pervasive phrase, yet The Secret Agent and Under Western Eyes, my two favorite Conrad novels, and perhaps this is the reason why they are both written in a manner that recalls Scott to me. So the first is so very different from anything he attempted. Yet, in this too, historical circumstance, encouraging the adoption of extreme and delusive politics, break Conrad's characters. Is there not a whiff of old mortality about these books? And doesn't Conrad's preference for the indirect approach also recall Scott's manner of narrative? To come to the present day, Gore Vidal's great series of novels are an attempt to do for the United States what the Waverley novels did for Scotland, to restore to a nation a sense of its own past and of the significance of that past. And if I may intrude a note of egotism, my last two novels, Augustus and A Question of Loyalties, owe far more to Scott than I ever realized while writing them. It is true that when I risk such an acknowledgement with its implied comparison, the line of Horace rises into my mind, parturient montes, nascetur ridiculus mus. The mountains will give birth, a ridiculous mouse will be born. But in this case, at least, to reverse the fable, The mouse is grateful to the lion and knows what it owes him. There are other things I've learned from Scott, though I wish I could employ the lesson better. I come back to the marriage of these two qualities. The view from Scott's window was, as I have said, extensive. But what of the matter that went on in his head? And here I think we come to the most remarkable thing about Scott, the heart of his genius. The man who forced history into the novel also went beyond history. The view from the window was not enough. The world of fact was deficient as a means of understanding the world. Indeed, the world, Scott knew, was beyond understanding. Everyone has been struck by the presence in the great novels of an element that resists or escapes understanding, an element we can only call timeless, that seems to hint at enchantments which have a significance that we experience even while we know we are unable to fathom it. They are generally associated with a single character, a Meg Merrilies, Elspeth Mucklebeckett, Madge Wildfire, or with isolated scenes like that one in The Heart of Midlothian, when Ginny questions the boy who, in killing Sir George Staunton, has been unconsciously guilty of parricide. He stretched out his hands, still smeared with blood, perhaps that of his father, and he ate voraciously and in silence. "What is your first name?" said Jeannie, by way of opening the conversation. "The Whistler." "But your Christian name, by which you were baptized?" "I never was baptized that I know of. I have no other name but the Whistler." Or it may be something interpolated, as it were, in the novel, like Wandering Willie's tale, which, though capable of rational explanation, yet calls all rationality into question. These are all moments which, in that fine phrase from the abbot, cause us to lose our grip on the anchor of futurity. Moments which call our understanding of experience into doubt, which cause the hairs on the back of their head to stand on end, or give that tingle of the spine which Vladimir Nabokov recognized as the surest sign of great art. It may seem too much to claim Scott as a progenitor of that mode of fiction, now fashionable, called magic realism. But listen to the definition of magic realism offered by the New Oxford Companion of English Literature. Magic realist novels have typically a strong narrative drive in which the recognizably realistic mingles with the unexpected and the inexplicable, and in which elements of dream, fairy story, or mythology combine with the everyday. Isn't that actually quite an accurate description of the Waverley novels? Though there, the extravagances of modern magic realists are governed instead by a powerful, lucid, and in important respects, skeptical intellect. The skepticism is important. It goes with the capaciousness of Scott's mind. He had, to a remarkable degree, that negative capability which Keats so admired in Shakespeare. In the end, human behavior and the march of history are never wholly explicable. Indeed, the more you know and understand of both, the more you realize the inadequacy of your knowledge and understanding. It is a shallow man who pretends to profound judgments. Of course, Scott was tempted by Augustan certainties, but he was held back by a strain of mystery which he got from his border childhood. Oh, I, he dreamt a dreary dream ayont the Isle of Skye. I saw a dead man win a fight, and I thought that man was I. Perhaps Scott's greatest achievement as a novelist was to be able to accommodate his understanding with his sense of what went beyond understanding. All the narratives of his great novels are ambivalent or ambiguous. They are, in the first place, scarcely ever told by Scott himself. He is not only swathed in a cloak of anonymity, but he impersonates other authors of his books. There is an artistic point in this. The abdication of authorial authority allows us to understand the more powerfully that events exist as they are presented to us, but also as they are not presented. There is never a single true version of a story, because the same events, seen from another angle, give us a different narrative. The indirect approach to fiction, like the device of letting us see historical characters through the eyes of fictional ones, or the device of non-existent narrators, is a means of denying absolute authority to the text he has brought into being. For such authority depends on the pretense that this is the only story and the only way it can be told, the pretense of the omniscient author. Scott denies himself such authority, and because he does so, achieves a greater one. For something which must have struck every sympathetic reader of the Waverley novels is that here is a man who is telling us what life is really like. Not the whole of life, because we cannot grasp that. Not the explanation or meaning of life, because that too is beyond us. But this is life as it is lived, confusing, yet ordered by intelligence, beyond intelligence, yet capable much of the time of being governed by it. Life which is affectionate and enriched by friendship, yet made desolate by cruelty and ingratitude. Life which the author cannot grasp or control, but which he accepts. I come to my last point. It is well known that Scott, influenced by the historians of the Scottish Enlightenment, who themselves in turn were later to influence Hegel and Marx, saw history as a clash of opposing forces, which never resulted in the absolute victory of the victors. The result of struggle was a new synthesis to which the defeated made their own contribution. The Jacobite cause was killed off, but Jacobitism survived as a sentiment which materially altered the temper of the conquerors. No victory is ever absolute in Scott. Something is lost in victory, and something triumphs in defeat. Succeeding generations are the heirs of both parties to a quarrel. This realization, too, is part of Scott's extraordinary capaciousness. Without sinking into the morass of moral relativism, he is able to show us how morality belongs to its time and place and is conditioned by it. Certain things are always good. Certain virtues are constant. Other things are always bad. Some vices are always there. But the form action takes is determined by circumstance and contingency, as well as by character and code. The novelist today has much to learn from Scott still in terms of technique and approach. But these are tools. It is the spirit that counts and that offers the most valuable lessons. I have said nothing of Scott's comedy, of his ability to construct dramatic scenes, of his range of characters, and of the enviable ease with which he traverses the whole of society. These aspects of his work may, in a gathering like this, be taken for granted. For me, the most profound message I receive from Scott is a warning against certainty, a warning against the arrogant assumption that life yields all its meaning either to intellect or faith, and a warning to be alert to the influence of contingency on men's will and character. And finally, a warning that the novelist neglects either the promptings of the imagination or the view from the window at his peril. With this in mind, I'll ask you to raise your glasses and drink to the man whom Hesketh Pearson, in two most admirable phrases, described as combining within himself much of Shakespeare's creative genius and no little of Dr. Johnson's uncommon sense, and as the only person within my knowledge whose greatness as a writer was matched by his goodness as a man. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, Sir Walter Scott.
Sir Walter Scott.